Greetings, Texas United Methodists. It is an honor to be amongst you this morning, to lead us in a teaching session on how our past can help us envision a more equitable future. I'm going to focus on three things in this talk, and these will hopefully help us reclaim our heritage of United Methodism. First, I want us to reclaim our Wesleyan heritage as prophetic offenders through an examination of Susanna Wesley's rebellious nature and her influence on John. Second, I want us to reclaim our sense of connectionalism by looking at John Wesley's submission to be more vile and his subsequent revolutionary ideas of systematic missiology. And third, I want us to reclaim our spirit as United Methodists towards these bold actions of our founders and to be willing to think creatively about how we do church differently, but especially how we do church differently in the future. I truly believe that if we want to be vital again as the United Methodist Church, we have to do the work of reclaiming our heritage. And in order to reclaim our heritage, we have to take that first deep dive into what it truly was. A tradition of bending the rules, of being ridiculed, of doing the unthinkable, all in order to spread the love of God to as many people as possible. Now, y'all, any good story, any good history starts with the stories of and voices of women. And any proper Methodist history starts with Susanna. The mother of John, Susanna was formidable. At the age of 19, she married Samuel Wesley, who was a priest in the Church of England. She gave birth to 19 children. She was raised in a dissenting household, which meant that Susanna was a bit skeptical of the Church of England. Her skepticism and strong will were then passed on to her children. And quite famously, Susanna taught her daughters to read before she taught them how to sew. Of this abnormal act, she wrote the following, quote, "The putting children to learn sewing before they can read perfectly is the very reason why so few women can read fit to be heard and never to be well understood." Now, the most illustrative story of her strong will takes place in 1712. Samuel had to travel to London to fulfill his duties as a priest and attend a convocation, kind of like y'all are attending a conference right now. He left his curate, Inman, in charge of his parish. Now, Susanna believed Inman to be, at best, a buffoon. In order to ensure the spiritual care of those at Epworth, she began to invite her friends, her family, their families, servants, and her children to her kitchen at the parish home on Sunday afternoons after church. Many of those living in Epworth shared Susanna's sentiment about Inman and began to choose her services over the official ones held at St. Andrew's. From her kitchen, she was soon preaching to over 200 people every Sunday. Now, Inman was quite insulted by this and writes to Samuel, and Samuel writes to Susanna. And Susanna dares to challenge Samuel. She insinuates that she would only cease preaching if Samuel, quote, "commanded me to desist." But Samuel knew better. Now, when all of this is happening, John Wesley is about 8 or 9 years old, and he sees his mother preaching to hundreds of people in her kitchen. From his mother's example, he realizes that to truly reach people, sometimes you have to bend the rules. Sometimes, in order to welcome people into the love of God, you have to do things that are unsanctioned. It is in, from, and through Susanna's influence that John begins to claim a sense of what I'm calling prophetic offense. And this is an ideology that I believe is truly at the heart of Methodism, and one that we've begun to lose. Prophetic offense. It's that willingness to look beyond today's acceptable practices, standards, and norms, and bend those rules in order to ensure that more and more persons can be included within the kingdom, and that all persons, no matter who they are, how they identify, whom they love, and how they live, can experience the love of God. They can know their own self-worth and can then grow to love themselves so that they can love others. Susanna preached a prophetic offense by simply embodying a female body and daring to preach in her own home. But she did so because she knew that there were persons in need of God's message of love. And fulfilling the commandment of God is greater than any offense one might cross. And y'all, John soaked this in. It first comes out in his days at Oxford. When the moniker Methodist begins to be used, it was used to describe a group of 4 to 5 people, some students, some fellows, all of them at Oxford. Now, John Wesley had already graduated, but was hanging around campus because his younger brother Charles was a student. And Charles had just begun this pietistic, Bible-centered study group on campus. Now, John had no idea what he wanted to do with his life at this point, but John, being John, took it over from his brother. And then the group quickly becomes ridiculed for their peculiar method of doing religion. They rose early, they studied scripture intently, they prayed incessantly, they fasted, they took communion more than once a year, they talked openly about their spirituality, they visited the sick, and they held each other accountable to all of this. In other words, they centered their lives on faith as love acted out. And this was weird. Most people back then, if they went to church or were welcomed into a sanctuary, they sat down, they listened to scripture, and maybe they heard a sermon if they didn't fall asleep. And then they left. There was no action required of them except filling a seat in the pew on Sunday morning. And even then, this was a privilege that was reserved for a select few, for those who had the proper attire, for those who had access to a parish, for those who had the luxury to take Sunday off from their labors. The idea of faith existing beyond the walls of a church was rather anathema. The idea of faith being something that was lived, embraced, embodied, that challenged the status quo. Now, at a place like Oxford, it's not only these prior named disciplines that are acts of social transgression that made these Methodists weird. It was also their willingness to break the political norms of their day. They left the walls of the city and went out to where the people were, to where the poor were, the outcast, the imprisoned. And they not only breached those walls, but they transgressed the religio, political, and social boundaries of whom was deemed worthy of God's love. They began to preach to these folks, to minister with them, and to ask them what their spirits needed. Now, John and his friends were called many things for this peculiar way of faith before they were labeled Methodists. Names such as Bible moths, sacramentarians, and the Holy Club were tossed around to describe them, all with a derisive tone. In the past few years, British Methodist historian Peter Forsyth has found what he believes to be the earliest written, published use of the term Methodist to describe John Wesley and his group. It was printed in an Oxford newspaper in 1732, in reference to John Wesley's ministry with a particular inmate at the Picardo prison, Thomas Blair. Now, most of the time, Wesley and his pals took food, drink, medicine, and reading materials to those imprisoned. Weekly, they prayed with them, and about once a month would do a full worship service. When they saw inhumane treatment directed at those who had no other options before them, the Holy Club took it upon themselves to hold the authorities accountable. But every now and then, their actions went a bit further, and they began to experiment with legal advocacy on behalf of a select few. Now, in 1732, this is particularly striking in Mr. Blair's case because he was on death row for the alleged crime of, air quotes, sodomy. Now, this was a catch-all term in the 18th century for sexual acts that did not lead to conception, and it was a capital offense. Wesley and his friend John Clayton believed that Mr. Blair was being victimized by his fellow inmates, and they sought to ensure his protection. Clayton and Wesley took a particular interest in their trial as they helped to marshal his evidence and sought to ensure that anyone would be convinced of his innocence. The day of the trial, Wesley rose at 4 a.m. and rode 12 miles on a horse to be present. Now, unfortunately, Mr. Blair was found guilty in the court of law, but his life was spared, perhaps because of Wesley's intervention, but who can say for sure? What we can say for sure is that Wesley was deemed guilty in the public's eye through association with, and especially defense of, Mr. Blair. Peter Forsyth argues that Wesley's defense of Mr. Blair, whose crime was too indelicate to mention, was a public witness that tipped the balance between the Methodists being tolerated and being castigated. After their defense of Mr. Blair, the Holy Club was ridiculed even more for their way of doing religion, for their method that upended the norm and bent the rules by living out the love of God through intentional outreach to those most in need. Powerfully, Forsyth declares, quote, "Wesley and his Oxford friends' eccentricities might be tolerated. Their excessive religious observance, their closed group identity, their self-denial and strict code of living, reminiscent of some of the wayward Puritan sects of the last century. Even their lowering themselves to undertake good works in the prisons and the workhouses was not beyond the pale. But it seems when they took up the advocacy of a man accused of sexual crimes, they crossed the boundary between the bizarre but tolerable and the reprehensible." Now, in 2023, as a person discerning what it means to be Methodist, as a person discerning what it means to be United Methodist, I find it striking that we do not hear this story. That one of Wesley's first and most bold acts of public witness was the defense of a man accused of this crime, and that this is how we got our name. After Oxford, John struggled with how to continue to live into his particular call. A few years later, on May 24th of 1738, John Wesley finally was assured of his faith when he felt his heart strangely warmed walking down Aldersgate Street. And while he was assured of God's love, he knew he did not want to be another parish priest. This is where the city of Bristol comes into play. Now, 2023 is not that different from Wesley's day. Many of the people in the 18th century were what we would call nuns and duns. They were tired of the institutional church because it did not meet their needs, and it refused to change in order to do so. People were expected to pay taxes to support the local church, but they didn't see the local church supporting their needs. The national landscape of England was broken up into parishes, and for centuries, this parish system worked well. However, all of this came to an end during the Industrial Revolution. Transitioning from rural farming and pastoral economies, millions of people abandoned their long-held family lands in search of what they believed to be lucrative industrial jobs. As a result, mass migrations exploded across England, up through Ireland, onto the North American colonies, and so forth. And under this stress, the parish system quickly collapsed. Millions of people were left without the necessary support system they had long known. And this provided critical opportunities for those early Methodist movements to evangelize and expand as they filled in the gaps through care of the poor and the disenfranchised, through the establishment of hospitals and schools. And from the very beginning, the itinerant commission demanded that we go to the collapsed places where life was most vulnerable and most disordered. Now, John Wesley gets called to Bristol in late March of 1739 by his longtime frenemy, George Whitefield. Now, George Whitefield had been in the city for a while, preaching to ever-increasing crowds, and he calls on John to assist. John arrives on March 31st and is astounded to find Whitefield preaching to thousands in the fields. He wrote in his journal, "I could scarcely reconcile myself at first to this strange way of preaching in the fields." Now, up until this point, John mostly had followed at least the preaching standards of his day. He said, quote, "I had been all my life, till very lately, so tenacious of every point relating to decency and order that I thought it should have been a sin, the saving of souls, if it was not done inside of a church." However, by April 2nd, only 2 days after his arrival, he does something he thought he never would. At 4 p.m, I submitted to be more vile and proclaimed in the highways the glad tidings of salvation, speaking from a little eminence in a ground adjoining to the city to about 3,000 people. Now, fellow Methodist historian and Texan, Professor Ted Campbell, recently analyzed various primary sources of John Wesley's and concludes that John's preaching in the fields of Bristol is not an in-the-moment movement of the Spirit, but it's an intentional, well-thought-out, vocational choice to be more vile. Campbell reminds us that it wasn't simply the act of preaching outdoors that broke the rules. It was John Wesley's preaching within another diocese, one that was not his own, one without permission, that directly and openly violated church law. It was transgressive, yet prophetic. Vile. Now, y'all who know me might be rolling your eyes right now, but I truly believe that we have something to learn from Wesley's submission to be more vile. I recently spoke to a group of clergy persons in the Tennessee West Kentucky Annual Conference. Afterwards, I received an email from pastor of Grace United Methodist Church in Jackson, Tennessee. Reverend Mary Beth Eberly called the action of Jesus entering Jerusalem on Palm Sunday vile, and then related this act to what we as Wesleyans are called to do in this world. The young adults who listened to her on that Sunday were so inspired by this idea of Wesleyan vile-tality that they made a t-shirt for their upcoming beach trip. It reads, "Vile. It's 4 o'clock somewhere." Dare I say it, y'all, if we want to reach people, if we want to reach young people in new ways, if we want to revive, renew, reinvigorate, and reimagine our mission in this world, perhaps we first need to submit to be more vile. My colleague, David Worthington, who serves as the Director of Global Relationships at John Wesley's New Room, brilliantly states that while John Wesley's heart may have been strangely warmed in London, it was set afire in Bristol. Within 3 days of being in Bristol, Wesley's entire framework of how to preach, where to preach, and what is proper versus what is missionally prophetic is wholly overthrown. This experience shook his foundational understanding of normativity, of acceptability, and replaced them with a desire to follow the Spirit of God and meet the people where they were. This is what I mean by prophetic offense, or Wesleyan vile-tality. And the submission to be more vile didn't end with John. When it comes to prophetic offense, I'm often drawn to the words of Mary Fletcher Bosanquet. She was one of the first female preachers of Wesley's movement, and of her own preaching, she said the following: "I am conscious how ridiculous I must appear in the eyes of many for so doing. Therefore, if some persons consider me an impudent woman and represent me as such, I cannot blame them. Besides, I do nothing but what Mr. Wesley approves. And as to reproach thrown by some on me, what have I to do with it but quietly go forward saying, I will still be more vile if my Lord requires it." Amen. Now, after Bristol, Wesley develops this new ecclesiology for the people called Methodist. They were going to do church differently. But how? Around 1745, John Wesley writes a treatise called Advice to the People Called Methodists. And it's through these words of Wesley that we can learn of his hopes for his people. And I think these 5 pieces of advice ring true for us today. Now, for a little bit of context, Wesley was trying to piece together a unified missional movement in the midst of mass chaos as to who was Methodist and who wasn't. Sound a little familiar? He begins this treatise with an acknowledgement that there were many people out there claiming to be Methodist, but not all were his Methodists. Sound familiar? So he's writing to those Methodists who profess to pursue holiness of heart and life. And over the next pages, he advises these people of 5 things, and take these to heart. First, you are a new people. Second, do not imagine you can avoid giving offense. Third, trust God with your all, then go on in the power of God's might. 4, keep in your path and be true to your principles. And 5, do not talk much of what you suffer. How might the United Methodist Church take Wesley's advice from 1745 and apply it to today? Well, we could be a new people. We have an interesting opportunity before us to pivot and to reclaim ourselves as new. In our past splits and mergers, it seems clear that we rarely took advantage of these transitional moments to really figure out who we are and to boldly proclaim our identity, our mission, and our space in this world. Think back to the dozens of splinters that happened in the first 50 years of the Methodist Episcopal Church. When the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, the Methodist Protestants, the Wesleyan Methodists, I could go on and on. When all of these groups left the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church didn't change. It didn't change because it was scared of losing more members. And y'all, that's what happens when you let numbers drive the conversation. We have before us now a moment to change to rethink who we want to be in the future, to be proactive, to be prophetic, to be vile. The question is, are we brave enough to do it? And this is where Wesley's second piece of advice comes in handy. We have to remember to not be afraid to offend people. John Wesley and those at Oxford were given many monikers for their weird way of doing religion. But the name that stuck was Methodist. And we need to remember that we cease to be Methodist when we forget that our name was at first an insult. Not everyone is going to like what we are doing. We have to be willing to make people uncomfortable, to open ourselves up to critique, because the love of God compels us to be weird, to experiment, to do things that others wouldn't, and to love people who others say aren't worthy of it. John Wesley was disparaged in his day. People who joined the Methodists were often disowned from their families. They were seen as an absurd, ridiculous group. They didn't gamble, they didn't drink, they didn't go to the theater. They walked around talking about universal salvation. They visited the sick and the imprisoned. They prayed incessantly. They let women preach. They mixed genders in secret meeting rooms. And they critiqued slavery at the height of the Atlantic slave trade. All of this was quite offensive to the majority of people in England. But good Lord, what an example they were. How can the United Methodist Church reclaim this type of prophetic offense? How can we dare to love God and spread God's love in such ways that just irks people to their core? What if we were to praise persons who did ministry differently? Persons who were willing, as the late and great John Lewis said, to get into good trouble. What stances should we take publicly that will get people talking about us, even protesting us? Now, Wesley's third and fourth points of advice relate to the words of Mary Bosanquet. The Lord does not ask us to do anything that we cannot do because God is always with us and anything is possible with God. All of this struggle, strife, and ridicule will be worth it in the end because we will be living a life of inward and outward holiness. And y'all, finally, Wesley advises his people to not complain, to not suffer openly, and to not ridicule and condemn those who offer critique. We really need this message. What this denomination is experiencing right now is not easy, nor should it be. We should all take a moment to grieve United Methodism as we've known it. But we also need to intentionally let ourselves dream, hope, prophesize, and change the conversation. Now, before concluding, I want to offer a tangible, prophetically offensive, vile, Wesleyan way forward for us. And what I'm going to offer isn't anything new or innovative. Sorry to disappoint. The most Wesleyan way for us to reclaim this, to revive ourselves and reimagine who we are, is to take a look at connectionalism. As United Methodists, we hear this word a lot. But what does it mean? Seriously, what does it mean? How does connectionalism benefit you, those in your pews, and those outside the church walls? Well, the answer is multifold because connectionalism itself is multifold. It is first and foremost a theological concept. For an illustration of this, I want to quickly turn to John Wesley's 1750 sermon, Catholic Spirit. Now, in this sermon, Wesley is trying to lay out means for groups who differ in theological opinions and modes of worship to come together and to find ways to walk hand in hand in the love of Christ. He says, "But although a difference in opinions or modes of worship may prevent an entire external union, yet need it prevent our union in affection. Though we cannot think alike, may we not love alike. May we not be of one heart, though we are not of one opinion. With all doubt we may. Herein, all the children of God may unite, notwithstanding these smaller differences. These remaining as they are, they may forward one another in love and in good works. In 2023, this kind of seems like an absurd notion, right? The United States landscape today is one of the most politically, socially, and theologically divisive in our history. Families are being torn apart due to differences of opinion on just about any topic you can name. And United Methodism isn't protected from this. It too is being torn apart through a diversity of opinions and modes of worship. However, Wesley dares us to remind us what it means to be connectional. You and I may differ on exegesis, on theology, on whether or not we should be more vile. But can we join hands and walk together out into the world to spread the love of God? Connectionalism is also a communal, a practical concept. As historian Russell Ritchie argues, Methodist theology is embedded in our practicality. His theology was found in how he acted, how he loved, how he transgressed the norms of his day. And his brilliance was the band, the class, and the societies which proactively responded to social change. Wesley's genius was his ability to take his vision and adapt it and mold it time and time and time again as the needs of people changed. He connected layers of communities together around accountability and ensured that they had each other's backs and were willing to listen to one another and to more especially to love one another. Connectionalism is also a political and an ecclesiological idea. When John Wesley sanctioned the beginning of the Methodist Episcopal Church in 1784, it was under the assumption that Methodists would continue to see him as its primary leader. And minus a small omission in 1787, they largely did. From our beginning, Methodists maintained a sense of identity across oceans. Methodism worked differently in the United States than it did in Britain because it had to. As Methodism spread around the world, it held certain tenets and systems in connection. It was connected not only theologically, but missionally, financially, and politically. And our itinerant ministry is at the heart of this connection. Persons who are set apart for the ordained ministry belong not to the local church, but to the conference. They agree to serve anywhere that God calls them or anywhere that their particular gifts might be best lived out. This is connectionalism. Local congregations are not on their own to develop their own resources, to pay for their own pastors, to fund their own missions, for we are a connected people. And Wesley was able to conceive of this in a world that was turned upside down. He developed new ways of bringing together old and scattered ideas. And this is what we need today. For our ability to innovate discipleship is at the heart of what it means to be Wesleyan. So to conclude, I want to get a bit personal. I want to share one of the main reasons that I stay United Methodist. As Bishop Harvey mentioned, both of my parents were ordained clergy persons in the United Methodist Church serving in Arkansas. I don't stay United Methodist because it's how I was raised or because it's easy. It's not. Growing up in Arkansas, many of my friends did not know that women could preach. I, with a mother for a preacher, or preacher for a mother, didn't know that women couldn't preach or shouldn't preach or weren't allowed to preach. The first bishop I remember meeting and engaging with was Bishop Janice Huey, a female bishop. But it's not until I got a bit older that I truly began to understand and appreciate this vile aspect of Methodism. Now, I've been general secretary for just over 2 years, and the most common question that I get is rather surprising. It's not about facts or theories of the past. People look at me and they say, "Why did you take this job?" And it's so hard to not smirk and say, "Because I get to geek out every single day," which is my literal dream come true. But the main reason that I love this job is that it offers me opportunities such as this. And the main reason I stay United Methodist is because of our past. The love lived out by those who have come before us. We are a unique tradition. Our books of discipline, all of them, start with a historic narrative of who we are. We are rooted in our past. And if we are brave enough, we can grow new sprouts, new blooms, new fruits that bear witness to our heritage, but reach us out into the sky beyond. In order to do this, we have to recognize that history isn't in the past, but history is now. It's living and breathing in and through and among us. And it should be informing how we shape our future, which questions we ask, and what conclusions we come to. Our job here is not to set up the United Methodist Church for today or tomorrow. We must set the stage for the United Methodist Church 100 years from now. In 100 years, I don't want generations, our future generations, to think, in 2023, they really had an opportunity to change, if only they had taken it. How do we get them to say, "Oh my goodness, during a global pandemic, during disaffiliations, during warfare, climate change, economic injustice, and a global racial reckoning, in the midst of all of this, those United Methodists in 2023, wow, look what they did. Look how they changed the conversation. Look how they sought to be new and different." We have that opportunity. It is difficult, but it is possible to reclaim our heritage as vile Wesleyans, to revive the Spirit of God working in and through us, and renew those inside and outside of our churches towards a holiness of heart and life. Y'all, if we want to be vital again as the United Methodist Church, we must first be willing to do the unimaginable, to preach in new fields, to create new communities in a disconnected world. We must embrace Wesley. We must dare to risk, dare to fail, dare to be ridiculed and the talk of the town. If we want to be vital again, y'all, we've got to be more vile. And it's up to all of us to join together, hand in hand, despite our differences, in this new thing that we should do. Thank you.